My name is June Calloway, and I am 28 years old, and I want to tell you about my sister's wedding and what my mother said to me 20 minutes before the reception began, and what happened as a direct consequence of it. My sister, Priya, is 31. She married a man named Callum in September of last year in a venue that held 200 people and had a catering team and a string quartet and fresh flowers on every table and a seating chart my mother had spent the better part of 4 months arranging. My mother is someone who uses organization as a form of control. This is not a criticism. It is an observation I have made over a long time and have accepted as simply the shape of who she is. The seating chart was not a logistical document. It was a statement about hierarchy and visibility, and who belonged at the center of a room and who did not. I had understood this about my mother for years. I had grown up as the second daughter in a family where second was not a neutral position. It was a position that carried a specific weight and a specific set of assignments. Priya was the eldest and the one my parents had organized their hopes and their public presentation around from the beginning. She was louder than me and more comfortable being centered, and she had, for as long as I could remember, occupied the visible and celebrated parts of our family while I had occupied the functional ones. I was the one who remembered the important dates and organized the logistics and showed up quietly when things needed doing without being asked. My family had called this being reliable. What they had meant, I came to understand over time, was that I was useful in the ways that did not require them to acknowledge me directly. I had spent years making a kind of peace with this. The peace was not acceptance. It was more like a decision to build my life somewhere that did not require my family's acknowledgement as a foundation. I had friends who saw me clearly and fully. I had a job I was good at and that was growing in ways I was proud of. I had an apartment I had made into something that felt like home. I went to the wedding because Priya was my sister, and I loved her in the complicated way that you love someone who has benefited from a dynamic they were not responsible for creating and have never fully examined. I went because it was her day, and I was not going to make it about anything else. Before I tell you what happened, please hit like and subscribe and drop your city in the comments. The venue had a main hall for the reception with round tables dressed in white linen and centerpieces of pale roses and greenery that Priya had chosen after 3 months of looking at mood boards. There was a head table for the wedding party across the far end of the room, and the family table was the round one nearest to it, set for 12. I had walked through the hall an hour before the reception began when the catering staff were doing final checks, and I had counted the chairs at the family table. There were 13. I had noted this and moved on because I did not yet know why it would matter. At 6:10, 20 minutes before the reception was due to begin, my mother found me in the corridor outside the main doors. She had her event coordinator expression on, which is a very particular look she deploys when she has already made a decision she intends to present as a logistical necessity rather than a choice. She said, "June, I need to talk to you about the seating." I said, "All right." She said, "There has been a miscalculation and we are a seat short at the family table." She said, "The kitchen has a small table and the catering staff are lovely, and it will actually be much quieter and more comfortable for you in there." She said it with the smoothness of someone who had rehearsed the framing. There was a beat in the corridor between us, a moment in which we looked at each other and both understood what was actually being said and what was not being said. The venue held 200 people. The family table had 13 chairs when I had counted them an hour ago, not 11. There was no miscalculation. There was a decision. The decision was about who belonged at the table and who did not, and it had been made in the same way decisions in my family had always been made, which was without consulting me and without acknowledging what was actually happening. I took my plate from the reception line. I walked through the corridor and pushed open the kitchen door and found the small table my mother had described near the far wall, and I sat down. The catering staff were, as my mother had said, lovely. One of them brought me a glass of sparkling water without being asked. Another smiled at me with the particular warmth of someone who has understood the situation without being told. I had been sitting there for approximately 5 minutes with my plate in front of me and the sound of the string quartet starting up faintly through the wall when the kitchen door opened again. The man who came through the door was Callum. He was still in his full wedding suit, a dark charcoal with a pale blue tie that matched the bridesmaids' dresses, and he had a plate in one hand, and his jacket was already slightly loosened at the collar the way men loosen their collars within the first 15 minutes of any event that requires formality. He looked at me and he said, "I heard there might be a seating issue." His voice was calm and level and specific in the way of someone who has been told something by someone they trust and has already formed a clear view about it. I said, "My mother said there was a miscalculation with the chairs." He set his plate down on the table across from me. He pulled out the chair, he sat down. He said, "June, I counted the chairs at the family table last Tuesday when we did the venue walkthrough. There were 13. I said, "I know." He said, "I know you know." He picked up his fork. He said, "Tell me about the new role. Priya mentioned you had made a change at work recently, and I want to hear about it." I want to be precise about what Callum did in that moment, because the precision of it matters more than any dramatic interpretation of it. He did not go back into the hall and make an announcement. He did not find my mother and confront her. He did not pull a chair from the family table into the kitchen to make a point. He did not turn it into a performance. He walked through a door and sat down and had dinner with me and asked about my life. He treated the situation as simple. He treated me as someone worth sitting with. That clarity, the absence of drama, and the presence of a simple human choice was the most effective response to what had happened that I can imagine anyone making. We sat in that kitchen for 40 minutes. He asked about the new role, and I told him about it in full, more than I would have told most people, because he was listening in the way that people listen when they are genuinely interested, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. I asked about the honeymoon destination they had chosen, and he described it with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has been looking forward to something for a long time. At one point, a member of the catering staff offered us both the starter course, and we accepted. The string quartet could be heard through the wall shifting from background music into something more formal. It was the best 40 minutes I spent that entire day. Priya came through the kitchen door after the first dances, still in her dress, her hair slightly looser than it had been in the ceremony. She had the expression of someone who has been looking for two people and is simultaneously relieved and unsurprised to have found them in the same room together. She looked at Callum, and she looked at me, and she looked at the plates in front of us, and she said, of course this is where you both are." She pulled out the third chair at the small table and sat down without asking whether she was interrupting, because she knew she was not. She stayed for 15 minutes before the event coordinator appeared at the kitchen door to tell her she was needed for the cake cutting and the formal photographs. Before she stood up, she looked at me across the table and she said, "I did not know, June." She said it quietly, and she kept her eyes on mine while she said it, and I believed her. Priya had spent her life being the person things were organized around rather than the person doing the organizing. She had not arranged the seating chart. She had not made the decision my mother had made. She had been standing at the head table in her dress with 200 guests in front of her, and she had not known what was happening in the kitchen 20 feet behind her. That is its own kind of harm, the harm of not knowing what is being done in your name and on your behalf. And I want to be fair about the fact that it is a different kind from the deliberate kind. It does not produce the same result for the person on the receiving end, but it comes from a different place, and that distinction matters to me. She left for the cake cutting, and Callum stood and straightened his jacket and looked at me and said, "One more thing." He said, "Priya and I are hosting Christmas this year." He said, "You will be at the table." He said it simply, without drama, in the tone of someone stating a fact about the near future that is not open to revision. I said, "Thank you." He nodded and went back to his reception. I sat in the kitchen for a few more minutes and finished my sparkling water, and one of the catering staff cleared the plates and said, "Your brother-in-law seems like a good one." I said, "I think he is." She said, "The good ones always notice." I thought about that sentence for a long time on the drive home. My mother and I have not spoken directly about what happened in the corridor before the reception. This is consistent with how my family handles the things it would prefer not to examine directly. There's no confrontation, no named reckoning, no conversation in which the thing is called what it is. There is the event, and then there is life resuming as though the event has been absorbed into the general background of how things are, with the understanding on both sides that something occurred that cannot be fully reversed by not mentioning it. My mother called me the week after the wedding to ask how I had enjoyed the day. I said the venue was beautiful and Priya had looked wonderful, both of which were true. She said, "I hope the kitchen was comfortable." I said, "It was fine." She said, "Good." That was the entirety of what was said about it. I have thought carefully about whether I should say more to her. I have sat with the question over a number of months and approached it from multiple directions. My conclusion is that a direct conversation with my mother about the kitchen would become a conversation about her intentions and her reasons and her version of events. And her intentions are not the thing I need addressed. I understand her intentions well enough. What I needed was not her explanation. What I needed was what Callum provided, which was a person choosing, without announcement or drama, to sit at the same table as me. You cannot extract that from a confrontation with someone who did the opposite. You can only find it in the people who already understand it. The first Christmas after the wedding was at Callum and Priya's apartment. 8 people, because their place holds 8 comfortably. Priya cooked and Callum handled the desserts with the focused enjoyment of someone who takes the task seriously and is also clearly having a good time doing it. My mother was there. She sat at the table, in the chair she was given, and she made conversation, and she ate the food, and she said the dessert was excellent. I sat at the same table, not at a different table in a separate room, not relocated due to a miscalculation. At the table, with a glass of wine, and Callum across from me, asking whether I wanted more potatoes. It was an ordinary dinner. I want to be precise about why an ordinary dinner mattered as much as it did. It mattered because ordinary had been deliberately withheld. An ordinary chair at an ordinary table, the thing that most people move through without a second dot, had been the exact thing removed. Having it back, quietly and without ceremony, in a room where Priya had set the table and Callum had counted the chairs, was the correct ending to the thing that had happened. Not drama, not confrontation, just a table with enough chairs and my name attached to one of them without qualification. Drop your city in the comments, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.